Her name was Clara Dolan. She was 81 years old, and she was dying in a charity ward in Omaha, Nebraska, in the spring of 1961. The nurses thought she was confused. She kept talking about a train. She kept saying the same thing, over and over, in a voice that had grown thin and papery with age. She said, "I remember who I was before they gave me away. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought it mattered." But Clara Dolan was the last surviving rider of the orphan trains, the greatest forced migration of children in American history. And what she remembered, what she had carried inside her for more than 70 years, was not the story America had told about those trains. It was the real one. The official history says the orphan trains were a mercy. It says Charles Loring Brace, the man who created them, was a visionary philanthropist who rescued nearly 200,000 children from the squalor of New York City streets and gave them new lives in the wholesome farmlands of the American heartland. That story appeared in textbooks. It was repeated in newspapers. It was taught to generations of American schoolchildren as an example of private charity working exactly as it should, the market solving a social problem without government interference. What that story leaves out is everything that actually happened. The orphan trains were not primarily a charity program. They were a labor redistribution system designed at the precise moment American agriculture needed cheap child labor on a massive scale. The children on those trains were not orphans. Most of them had living parents, and the families those children were placed with were not vetted, were not monitored, and were not held accountable for what happened inside their homes. Clara Dolan knew all of this. She had lived all of this, and before she died, she told a young nursing student named Rosemary Atkins everything she remembered. Rosemary kept the notes for 40 years. She thought someone official would eventually want them. Nobody ever came. Today, we are going to tell you what Clara said, and we are going to show you why the people who ran the Orphan Train program needed her to forget it. To understand what the orphan trains actually were, you first have to understand what they were supposed to be. The story begins in 1853 in New York City. The city has a problem that its newspapers are calling a crisis. Tens of thousands of children are living and dying in the streets of lower Manhattan. They are picking pockets. They are sleeping under piers. They are dying of cholera and typhus and simple exposure in alleyways that the rest of the city pretends not to see. The newspapers call them street Arabs, they call them waifs, they call them the dangerous classes. The language itself tells you something about how the city views these children. They are not seen as victims of poverty or immigration policy or the catastrophic conditions in the tenement districts. They are seen as a threat, a social contagion, a problem to be managed. Into this situation steps Charles Loring Brace. He is 27 years old, a Yale-educated minister's son from Connecticut, and he is burning with evangelical energy and progressive ideas. He founds the Children's Aid Society in 1853. He writes pamphlets, he raises money, he gives lectures. He is extraordinarily effective at all of it. And in 1854 he proposes a solution. He calls it placing out. The idea is simple on its surface. Take the children off the streets of New York, put them on trains, send them west to farming families who will take them in, feed them, clothe them, educate them, and raise them as their own. The newspapers love it. The donors love it. The city government, which has been spending money on overcrowded orphan asylums for decades, loves it most of all. What nobody asks at this moment, the question that does not appear in the pamphlets or the fundraising letters or the newspaper coverage, is this: who exactly are these children? Where did they come from? And what happens to them after the train leaves? Here is the answer to the first question, and it is the answer that changes everything. The children on the orphan trains were, in the overwhelming majority, not orphans. A study published decades later, drawing on Children's Aid Society records, found that fewer than 1 in 4 of the children sent west had lost both parents. Most had one living parent. Many had 2. They were children whose families had been torn apart not by death, but by poverty, and by the deliberate choices of a system that treated poverty as a moral failing rather than an economic condition. Clara Dolan's mother was alive when Clara was put on a train in 1886. Her name was Bridget Dolan. She was Irish, she was a widow, and she was working 14-hour days in a garment factory on Mulberry Street for wages that could not cover rent and food and coal for a family of 3 children. She did not surrender Clara willingly. She did not sign papers. She came home from work one evening to find that the Children's Aid Society had visited her building, spoken to her landlord, and determined that her children were living in conditions of neglect. Clara was 7 years old. Her mother was not neglectful. She was poor. In 1886, in New York City, those two things were treated as identical. Now here is where the standard history of the orphan train stops being a story about charity and starts being a story about labour markets. Because the timing of the orphan trains is not accidental. It fits almost perfectly onto the graph of American agricultural expansion. The years between 1854 and 1929, the years the trains ran, were the years of the great westward agricultural push. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened millions of acres of federal land to settlement. The railroad companies were pushing tracks across Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and beyond. New farms were being broken from prairie every single season. And those farms needed labor. Adult farmhands cost money. They had to be paid wages. They could organize. They could leave. Children from the orphan trains cost nothing. They came with no contracts. They had no legal standing. They could not leave because they had nowhere to go and no money to get there. And if a family wanted to send a child back, the return procedure was so cumbersome and so poorly administered that it almost never happened. Charles Loring Brace was not stupid, but he knew what he was building. In his own writings, he described the program explicitly as a solution to two problems at once: the surplus of destitute children in the cities and the shortage of labor in the rural West. He used the word labor. He used the phrase farm help. In his 1872 book, The Dangerous Classes of New York and 20 Years' Work Among Them, he wrote that the Western farmer received not just a child, but a worker. When you read those words, the charitable framing cracks open, because a system designed to provide workers is not a system designed for the welfare of the children it moves. It is a system designed for the welfare of the people who receive them. The families who took in orphan train children were not required to adopt them. They were not required to educate them. They were not required to pay them. They signed a piece of paper agreeing, in the vaguest possible language, to treat the child as a member of the family. There was no enforcement mechanism. There was no follow-up visit scheduled. There was no way for the child to file a complaint. The Children's Aid Society employed travelling agents whose job was to visit placed children and check on their conditions. Those agents were responsible for territories covering hundreds of square miles. They visited each child, at most, once a year, usually less. What this meant in practice was that a child placed on a farm in Nebraska in October would not see a representative of the organization that placed her until the following harvest, at the earliest. And by then, if something bad had happened, the child had long since learned what happened to children who complained. Clara Dolan learned this lesson in the winter of 1886, in a farmhouse outside of Beatrice, Nebraska, 4 months after she arrived. Rosemary Adkins was 19 years old in 1961. She was a nursing student at Emmanuel Hospital in Omaha, and she had been assigned to the charity ward as part of her training. The charity ward was where they put the patients who had nobody and nothing, the patients who were going to die and who would be buried in county plots if no family came forward. Clara Dolan had been in the ward for 11 days when Rosemary was assigned to her care. What Rosemary remembered 40 years later, when a researcher finally found her in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, was that Clara did not seem confused. She seemed deliberate. She seemed like someone who had been waiting a very long time to say certain things out loud, and who understood that she was running out of time to say them. Clara told Rosemary that she had been 7 years old when the agent from the Children's Aid Society came to her building on Mott Street. She remembered the man's coat. She remembered that he had a clipboard. She remembered that he smelled like tobacco and something sweet, like fruit that had begun to turn. She remembered the train, not the sadness of it, though she said she cried for 3 days. She remembered the specific physical details, the wooden seats, the smell of coal smoke, the way the other children, 22 of them from her car alone, pressed their faces against the windows as the city disappeared. She said the city went away like something being erased. They stopped at a town in Indiana and some children got off. They stopped in Ohio and more got off. By the time the train reached Nebraska, there were 6 children left, in Clara's car. They were the ones nobody had wanted yet. Clara said she understood, even at 7, what it meant to still be on the train that far west. She said she understood that she was becoming cheaper. The family that took her was named Hartwell, Elias Hartwell and his wife, Louise. They had a corn and hog operation outside of Beatrice. They had 2 sons of their own, both older than Clara. They had requested a girl specifically, which Clara said she did not understand until much later. They had requested a girl because they needed someone to do the domestic work, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, the mending, the churning. The work that Louise Hartwell's back was no longer able to sustain. Clara was not a daughter. She was a replacement for a hired girl. She was cheaper than a hired girl because she came with no wage attached. Clara told Rosemary that she was not beaten. She was careful to say that. She said the Hartwells were not cruel people in the way that people use the word cruel. They did not strike her. They fed her. She had a bed, a real bed, not a pallet, in a room off the kitchen. But she also said this: they never once pretended, not even for a single day, that she was a member of the family. She ate after the family ate. She was not introduced to neighbours. She was not allowed to attend church with the family for the first 2 years because, as Elias Hartwell explained to her without embarrassment, he did not want people asking questions about where she came from. She was not enrolled in school until she was 9, and then only for 4 months of the year, when the farm did not need her. She told Rosemary she remembered the exact moment she understood her situation completely. It was the winter of 1886. She was sick, she thought it was influenza, and she stayed in bed for a day. Louise Hartwell came to the door of her room and stood in the doorway and said, in a voice that was not unkind but was absolutely final, "Clara, the eggs don't collect themselves." Clara got up. She collected the eggs. She said she cried while she did it, not from sadness, but from something she did not have a word for yet. She said she found the word about 30 years later. The word was clarity. Now step back from Clara's story for a moment and look at the scale of what the Orphan Train program represented. Because when you look at the numbers, the charitable framing becomes even harder to sustain. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society and similar organisations placed approximately 200,000 children in rural homes across 35 states and 4 Canadian provinces. 200,000 children in 75 years of operation. That is not a charity program, that is an industry. And like any industry, it had economic incentives built into its structure that shaped the outcomes it produced. The Children's Aid Society received funding from New York City government based on the number of children it removed from city streets. More placements meant more funding. This created pressure, internal pressure, to increase the volume of children processed through the system. At the receiving end, the demand from farming communities was not a constant. It spiked during planting season. It spiked during harvest. The agents who travelled with the trains kept records, and those records, many of which survived into the 20th century, show a clear seasonal pattern in placements. Children were most likely to be taken from trains in April and in September. April is planting. September is harvest. The children were not placed according to where they would thrive. They were placed according to where they were needed. There is another number that the standard histories almost never mention. Of the approximately 200,000 children placed by the orphan trains, and historians who have studied the program estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40% were eventually returned to the organization. Returned, like goods that did not meet expectations. The return rate was so high that the Children's Aid Society eventually created a form for it, a standard form with checkboxes. The reasons listed on the form included child unsuitable for farm work, child of difficult disposition, child too young for placement, and child's health unsatisfactory. None of the checkboxes said, we worked this child too hard and she got sick. None of them said, we found out the boy we took had a learning difficulty and we could not use him. None of them said, we changed our minds, but those were the reasons. And when children were returned, they went back into the system. They were put on another train. They were offered to another family. Some children rode the trains multiple times. There are records of children who were placed, returned, placed again, returned again, 3 and 4 times before the system gave up on finding them a situation and deposited them in a state institution. Clara was never returned, but she knew children who were. She met a boy named Thomas, she never learned his last name, on the train going out, and she heard from another child, years later, that Thomas had been sent back twice and had ended up in a reformatory in Kansas. She did not know what became of him after that. She said she thought about Thomas her whole life. She said he had a way of laughing that made everything feel slightly less terrible, and that she had never met anyone else who laughed quite like that. But here is the question that the revisionist economic history of the orphan trains cannot avoid. How did this continue for 75 years without a serious public reckoning? The answer has several parts, and each part tells you something about how economic systems protect themselves from accountability. The first part is the narrative architecture that was built around the programme from the very beginning. Charles Loring Brace was not just a programme administrator. He was an extraordinarily skilled propagandist, in the neutral sense of that word. He understood that the programme's survival depended on public support, and public support depended on a particular story being told and believed. The story Brace told was of rescue. The children were in danger. The streets were destroying them. The programme was saving them. The framing made it almost impossible to criticise, because any criticism could be reframed as opposition to saving children. This is a rhetorical structure that appears over and over in the history of programmes that use vulnerable populations. The framing makes the helper the hero and the helped essentially voiceless. The children on the orphan trains were voiceless, in a very literal sense. They had no legal standing. They could not vote. They could not sue. They could not go to newspapers. A child who tried to complain about her situation faced one of two responses. She was not believed, or she was told that complaining proved she was an ingrate who did not appreciate the mercy that had been shown to her. The second part of the silence is economic. The farming communities that received orphan train children were not going to complain about the programme. They were the beneficiaries of it, and those communities had political representation, substantial political representation, in state legislatures and in Congress. The children who had been placed had no such representation. This is the structural asymmetry that allows exploitative systems to persist. The people who benefit have power. The people who are harmed do not. And the narrative that surrounds the system makes it morally uncomfortable to even suggest that the harm is happening. The third part of the silence is the one that Clara Dolan identified herself, and it is the most psychologically sophisticated of the three. She told Rosemary the worst thing they did was make us grateful. She meant it as a description of a mechanism, not as an accusation against individuals. She said that the children who survived the orphan trains, who built lives out of whatever they were given, who married and had families and grew old, those children had an enormous psychological investment in the story that the trains had saved them. To believe otherwise, to believe that what happened to them was not rescue but exploitation, was to believe that their entire lives had been built on something ugly. Most people cannot do that. Most people will choose the story that allows them to go on. So the survivors of the orphan trains, the ones who did well enough to have voices that mattered, mostly told the official story. They told it because it was easier. They told it because they had come to believe it, and in telling it, they helped bury the experiences of the children who had not done well, the ones who had been returned, the ones who had been broken, the Thomas who ended up in the reformatory in Kansas. Clara said she had told the official story herself for most of her life. She had told it to her husband, who knew her history. She had told it to her children. She said she had stopped believing it sometime around 1930, when the Depression came, and she watched what happened to poor families and poor children, and she recognized it. She recognized the machinery of it. She said, I had seen it work on me, and I knew the shape of it, but she had kept telling the story anyway, because by then the story was part of who she was, and you cannot easily take a story out of a person once it has been in there long enough. She told Rosemary, I am only telling you the real one now because I am about to be dead, and the dead do not need to be grateful to anyone. Let's put the economic case together plainly, because it has never been assembled in one place in the way that it deserves to be. The Orphan Train programme existed at the intersection of three economic pressures. The first was urban labour surplus. New York City in the second half of the 19th century was receiving enormous waves of immigration, primarily from Ireland and southern and eastern Europe. These immigrants arrived poor, often destitute, and they crowded into the tenement districts of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn in conditions of poverty that were genuinely terrible. The children of these immigrants were not in the main abandoned or neglected in any meaningful sense. They were simply poor. And in the economic and moral framework of Gilded Age America, being poor was evidence of moral failure, and moral failure disqualified you from certain protections. The second pressure was agricultural labour demand. The homesteading of the Great Plains required labour, and that labour was chronically undersupplied. Adult farmhands were expensive. They were increasingly organised. They had begun by the 1870s and 1880s to make wage demands that cut into the margins of small and medium farming operations. Children were not organised. Children could not make wage demands. Children who had been removed from their families and transported across the country were, structurally, in the position of indentured workers without indenture contracts. They were bound not by a legal document, but by their complete helplessness. They had nowhere to go. They had no money. They had no family. They could not leave. The third pressure was philanthropic finance. The Children's Aid Society was not a government program. It was a private charity, funded by donors from New York's merchant and professional classes. Those donors had a particular set of beliefs about poverty and charity and the proper relationship between the classes. They believed that the deserving poor could be improved through discipline and honest work, and that the environment of the rural farm, with its Protestant ethic and its distance from the corrupting influences of the city, was the ideal setting for such improvement. This belief was not disinterested. The donors were, in the main, people who owned factories and businesses that employed the parents of these children. They had a direct financial interest in maintaining a labour force that was controllable and cheap. Funding the orphan trains did not conflict with that interest. In a very real sense, it served it. By removing the surplus children of the urban poor from the city, the programme reduced the visibility of poverty without reducing poverty itself. It made the problem less visible, which made the donors less uncomfortable, which made the status quo more sustainable. This is the economic argument in its starkest form. The orphan trains were not a solution to child poverty. They were a mechanism for making child poverty invisible in the cities where wealthy people lived, while redistributing the labour of poor children to areas where that labour could be economically exploited. That is a brutal thing to say, but it is what the numbers support. Clara Dolan was not the only survivor who told a different story. She was simply among the last. Beginning in the 1970s, a small group of researchers began trying to collect oral histories from aging orphan train survivors before they all died. What those researchers found, when they found survivors willing to talk honestly, was a picture that looked almost nothing like the official narrative. They found survivors who had worked from before dawn until after dark on farms in Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri, from the time they were 8 and 9 years old, in conditions that would today be classified as child labour. They found survivors who had never been enrolled in school, who were functionally illiterate as adults because the families that took them needed their labour more than their education. They found survivors who had been placed with families that then dissolved, through death or divorce or financial ruin, and who had been passed from household to household, sometimes 5 and 6 times before they were old enough to simply walk away. They found survivors who had searched their entire adult lives for their birth families and never found them, not because their parents were dead, but because the records the Children's Aid Society kept were incomplete, inconsistently organised, and in some cases deliberately vague about the origins of the children it moved. They found survivors who did not know their own birthdays, who did not know their real names because the families that took them had renamed them, sometimes on the day they arrived. Clara Dolan was not Clara when she got on the train. She was Maeve, her Maeve Bridget Dolan. The Hartwells called her Clara because they said Maeve was a foreign-sounding name, and they did not want to explain it. She had been Clara for 74 years by the time she died. She told Rosemary that she had never stopped thinking of herself as Maeve, not inside. She said, "They took my name first, everything else came after." There is one more dimension of the orphan train story that the standard histories handle very poorly, and it has to do with race. The children on the orphan trains were predominantly white. They were predominantly Irish and Italian and Eastern European Jewish. The Children's Aid Society, in its early decades, occasionally placed black children, but the rural communities that received orphan trains were often unwilling to take non-white children. And the society responded to that preference. What this means in economic terms is that the orphan train system was a racialized labour redistribution programme. It moved the surplus children of white immigrant families to white farming communities in the rural West. Black children who existed in conditions of poverty in New York that were, if anything, worse than the conditions facing white immigrant children were largely excluded from even this deeply flawed form of intervention. There is a grotesque logic to this that becomes clear when you examine the period. The years the orphan trains ran were the years of the rapid expansion of the agricultural economy of the American heartland. That economy had been built in its earlier form on enslaved black labor. After emancipation, it needed a new form of cheap, wire controllable agricultural labor. It got that labor partly from the orphan trains, which supplied white children to white farmers. The children on the trains were exploited, but they were exploited in a way that also reinforced the racial architecture of American agriculture by supplying white labor to white farms and thereby reducing the economic incentive to integrate those farms or to bring black workers north and west in significant numbers. The history of the orphan trains is, among other things, a history of how the labor needs of a racialized economy shaped a program that was publicly framed as colorblind charity. Clara Dolan did not frame it this way. She did not have the analytical vocabulary for it, but she told Rosemary something that points in this direction. She said that when she arrived at the Hartwell farm, there had briefly been a black farmhand named George who worked for wages. He left within a year of Clara's arrival. She said she had always assumed he left because wages were being offered elsewhere, but she remembered that Elias Hartwell had not replaced him. He had not needed to. Clara could do the work George had not been doing, the domestic work which freed Louise Hartwell to help with more of the field work, which reduced the need for a paid outside hand. She said, "I understand now that I was cheaper than George, and that was the point." The orphan trains stopped running in 1929. The official explanation is that changing social attitudes about child welfare made the program obsolete. The growth of foster care systems and child labor laws meant that the specific conditions the program had exploited no longer existed in the same form. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What actually happened to the orphan trains is a more complicated story, and it involves the collision of the program with three forces it could not survive. The first force was the progressive movement's focus on child labor reform. By the first decade of the 20th century, reformers were beginning to investigate and publicize the conditions under which children lived and worked in American industry. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, conducted investigations and published photographs that shocked middle-class Americans who had not previously thought much about the labor of children. This created a political environment in which placing children with farming families for the purpose of farm labor became harder to defend publicly. The second force was the professionalization of social work. By the 1910s and 1920s, social work was becoming an academic discipline with professional standards and trained practitioners. The new professionals looked at the orphan train system and saw what it actually was: an unregulated, unmonitored placement program with no systematic follow-up, no legal protections for placed children, and no meaningful accountability for receiving families. They did not like it. They said so, loudly and repeatedly. The third force was the Depression. The economic catastrophe of 1929 destroyed the demand for orphan train children almost overnight. Farming families that had been willing to take in a child when times were good were suddenly unable to feed their own families. The receiving end of the pipeline collapsed, and without it, the program had no function. What did not happen, and what is telling about the program's legacy, was a reckoning. There was no formal investigation into what had happened to the children who had been placed. There was no systematic effort to reconnect placed children with their birth families. There was no acknowledgement from the Children's Aid Society or from any level of government that the program had been structured in ways that allowed exploitation. The program simply stopped, and its survivors, those who had done reasonably well, told the official story. How? And those who had not done well were mostly dead or silent, or living in conditions that gave them no platform to speak from. Clara Dolan was living on Social Security and a small pension from a laundry where she had worked for 30 years. She had no platform. She had Rosemary, a 19-year-old nursing student who had been assigned to her bed in a charity ward. She used what she had. Rosemary Adkins graduated from nursing school in 1963. She worked as a nurse for 31 years. She married, had 3 children, moved to Arizona in 1987. She kept the notes she had made during Clara's final days in a shoebox in a closet. She kept them because something told her they were important. She was not sure who they were important to, or how to make them matter, but she kept them. In 2001, a historian named Patricia Fagan, who was writing a book about orphan train survivors, found Rosemary through a chain of connections that involved a retired social worker in Omaha who remembered hearing about a nursing student who had talked to one of the last riders. Fagan spent 2 days with Rosemary in Scottsdale going through the notes. What Fagan found was not a polished account. It was fragments. It was the things a dying 81-year-old woman had said to a 19-year-old who was writing as fast as she could and not always catching every word. But the fragments were enough. Fagan published them in an appendix to her book, which came out in 2004 and which received respectful reviews in academic journals and was then largely ignored by the wider public. The appendix is 16 pages long. It is titled, What Clara Said. Here are some of the things Clara said, as recorded by Rosemary and published by Fagan. She said, "My mother was not a bad woman. She was a poor woman. They decided those were the same thing." She said, "The man on the train told us we were going to good homes. He believed it, I think." That was the worst part. He believed it. She said, "I looked for my mother for 40 years. I wrote letters. Nobody at the society ever wrote back. I think the records were not kept the way they said they were kept." She said, "Louise Hartwell was not a cruel woman, but I was never a child in that house. I was a function. Do you understand what that means? A function. Something that did what it was supposed to do." She said, "I had children of my own, 3 of them. I was a good mother. I know I was, but I was always afraid. I was always afraid that something would come and take them. I never stopped being afraid of that, not once, not even when they were grown." She said, "Tell someone. I don't know who, but tell someone." Clara Dolan died on April 14th, 1961. She was buried in a county plot in Douglas County, Nebraska. The marker is a small stone with her name and the years of her birth and death. Nothing else. The lesson of the orphan trains is not primarily about cruelty. It is about structure. It is about what happens when a program designed to serve an economic function is allowed to dress itself in the language of charity, and what that dressing accomplishes. The language of charity made the orphan trains invisible as an economic system. It made the labour extraction invisible. It made the displacement of families invisible. It made the non-orphan status of the children invisible. It made the systematic exclusion of black children invisible. It made the seasonal correlation between placements and harvest schedules invisible. And it made the children themselves invisible, because children who have been rescued cannot be victims. Children who have been saved have a debt to pay. Children who complain about their saving are ungrateful, and ungrateful children do not get listened to. This is not a pattern unique to the orphan trains. It is a pattern that appears throughout the history of programs that use vulnerable populations to solve economic problems while maintaining a moral alibi. It appeared in the Indian boarding school system, which ran in parallel with the orphan trains and used almost identical rhetoric of rescue and improvement. It appears in the history of welfare reform, where the language of opportunity and self-sufficiency has repeatedly been used to reduce support to people in poverty while demanding their labour in return for diminished assistance. The pattern is always the same. Identify a population that has no political power. Frame their condition as a moral problem that requires intervention. Design an intervention that serves economic interests while appearing to serve the population. Build a narrative around the intervention that makes it resistant to criticism. And make sure the people the intervention harms have no platform from which to contradict the narrative. This is what Clara Maeve Dolan understood. She had learned it with her body over 81 years. How, beginning with the day, a man with a clipboard and the smell of turning fruit came to her building on Mott Street and decided that her mother's poverty was the same thing as her mother's failure. She told Rosemary, "I am not angry. I am too old to be angry. But I want someone to know that I always knew. I knew what I was for. I knew why they put me on that train. And I knew it was not for my benefit." She paused, and then she said, "Knowing it did not help me, but maybe it will help someone." Rosemary kept the notes for 40 years. Now you know. If this kind of history, the kind that goes looking behind the official story for the economic machinery underneath it, is something you want more of, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. We do not repeat the version that was written for the people who benefited. Actually, we go looking for the version that was written in the margins by the people who didn't. The next video in this series looks at another program America called charity, another system that wore philanthropy like a coat over something much colder. That video is on screen now. Click it. We'll see you there.